A lot of people really take loosey-goosey 10 minutes. Not you. The best of us. Yeah, give it up for you and timeliness. Yeah, one person clapping. Perfect. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to tell a joke, and mostly it's to stall for the late people, but we have something that they'll never have, okay? In fact, we should, like, right before I begin, let's pretend we all had, like, an inside joke together, okay? So everyone, I'll say, and you know what my favorite food is? And everyone yell muffins, okay? But we're going to do this in like 3 minutes when people have shuffled back in. Does this make sense? Does everyone understand? Eye contact? Okay. So remember this in 3 minutes. I'm just going to do normal comedy. It'll be great. And then there's going to be someone will sit next to you and they'll go, muffins? And it'll be amazing. And we'll have a moment, okay? Because you deserve something. Okay, people are coming back in. Anyways, as I was saying, no one suspects anything. This has been so great. This has been such an empowering day. And the fact that the oil industry pulled back the referendum, what Jane Fonda was talking about, that's unbelievable news. That's unreal. That's incredible. And I think we should applaud again. It's unbelievable. I want to tell you, like, in high school, I took a personal carbon footprint. Did anyone, maybe Snap, has anyone taken a personal carbon footprint? If you don't know, personal carbon footprint is like this list, and it's this long list, and you just mostly fill things out, and you like feel very guilty. That's it. I took it in high school, and I grew up really Catholic, so I was like, I know guilt. I was like adding things to it, and I was like, also I've masturbated. I don't know if I can say that. It's after 8 p.m. We're fine. I'm so sorry. Live stream. So I filled out this list. Okay, and it just is. My family's Colombian, and they're all there, right? So I immigrated at this point. I was an immigrant, and I remember one trip was like, one of the things was like, do you ever go on an airplane? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, that's bad. And I was like, but that's my family. So I filled out this list, and I got a score of how guilty I was. Okay, and then a few years ago, did you know this? I found out that the personal carbon footprint was created by BP. It was created by BP to shift blame into the individual. Also, BP created it, famous for like spilling oil into the Gulf of Mexico, was like telling me things. I was like, beep. This is like if your like wildest friend was like, you need to stop drinking. And it's like, you're drunk at noon, Derek. Maybe sit this one out, BP. You're making me, it was unbelievable. I like couldn't, like they're like, do you ever use a plastic water bottle when you have no other choice? And as they're asking you, they're pouring oil into the mouth of a turtle. They're like, you don't ever drive, do you? Oh, you do? That's bad. Anyways, use our fuel. So it just is great. I'm glad that we're taking a stand. I'm glad that we're doing something about it. And I think if there's one takeaway, it's, you all know what my favorite food is. Perfect. Honestly, nailed the landing. Enough people walked in that I think they're confused. This is incredible. I'm so excited. This is the last workshop. I said this before. There's going to be a presentation. There's going to be a discussion. And then we're actually going to do things. We're going to end workshopping, getting into small groups and doing things. And I love that. I love that this is not just ideas. It's also action. And I'm so excited to present our first presenter, okay? It's going to lay out everything we're going to do. She is a dear friend. She's a Grist 50 fixer. That's a fun big deal. She's the executive director at Probable Futures. Please make some noise. Are you ready for her last name? It tells you everything you need to know. Please make some noise for Allison Smart. This is it.
Hello, Hollywood Climate Summit. I'm so thrilled to be here again. My name is Allison Smart, as Esteban said. And today, for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about world building, okay? And I know that concept is pretty familiar to most of you in this audience. Being in entertainment, you're engaged in imagining worlds, imagining circumstances, imagining stories. But I gotta tell you, outside of the entertainment community, not a whole lot of intentional world building going on, okay? Most people, when they think about the future, they assume it's gonna be a lot like the past. And I think that that has caused us to think about climate change and think about climate change in the future and what the future might look like in pretty reductive ways. In fact, I think we've mainly had two narratives when it comes to thinking about the future in climate change. And they kind of look like this. And these narratives certainly play out in entertainment, but they also play out in the media. To some extent, they play out even in the climate movement, in the climate community, and also certainly just in conversation about climate change. But we have two different futures here. One where we have some kind of more modern architecture and electric cars. Climate change has kind of been magically solved in the background without much engagement from us. Probably some tech bros have figured it out with some venture capital. There isn't really much that has changed for better or for worse. And then we have this other narrative that is perpetual apocalypse. And I am here today to ground our conversations and ground our world building in what climate science actually tells us about the current level of warming and about the near future. Okay? And climate science does not support either one of these narratives. Unfortunately, we are living with climate change already. We will continue to for some time, even in the best case scenarios. But perpetual apocalypse is a ways off, unlikely, and completely avoidable. Also probably doesn't look a lot like that. But there's a reason that people are so conditioned to think that the future will be a lot like the past. And that's because for a long time, the past was a really good predictor for the future, especially in the climate. So we're looking at some climate science right here. We're looking at a graph of the global temperature history of the Earth, and this graph starts at the dawn of civilization, around 12,000 years ago in 9500 BCE. And what this graph is doing is it's showing the global average temperature for each of these 12,000 years and then comparing it to that of the late 19th century. So the way to understand this graph is that the closer the data point is to 0, the more stable the global average temperature was. And by extension, the more stable the climate was. So look at that. That's a very straight line there, that green band. Over 12,000 years, the climate barely even fluctuated a degree. And so what was happening within those 12,000 years? Well, communities were forming. And those communities formed their own cultures, their own ways of life. And then often, those ways of life would formalize into governments. And those governments eventually built infrastructure, anything from roads and bridges or even food storage to laws and policies that figuratively and literally paved the way for industry and for specializations, the kind of specializations that we see in our society today. But what about before civilization? What about before 9500 BCE? Because humans were mobile before that. Humans have been around for a long time. In fact, we've been around for about 200,000 years. Our earliest ancestors emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago. And for the first 190,000 years of our existence, we were a nomadic hunting and gathering species. We did not settle. We did not create long-term settlements. We did not have civilization. And this graph helps us understand why. Look how dramatically the global average temperature, and by extension the climate, changed in those 190,000 years. A changing climate at that magnitude was just not conducive to settling into one place. What was conducive was that, climate stability. Climate stability allowed us to do things like practice agriculture and stay in a place knowing that that place and the patterns and the things that grew and things that thrived in that place would stay the same over the long term. Got a little delay going on here with the clicker. Should I point it somewhere else? Point it here? Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now we know that a stable climate was actually the foundation for all of those layers of civilization that we built on top of it. And the climate of civilization wasn't just stable, it actually happened to be perfect for humans. There were large expanses of temperate land where we could spread out and settle. There were stable seasonal patterns. So even if you lived in a place like the Arctic, or if you lived in a place with monsoons, you could still build a society around those patterns because they were the same year after year. And nowhere on Earth was it too hot for the human body. In other words, rain was like romantic. It was kissable rain. And that's the way we treated it in media. And hot, humid weather was pretty sexy, actually, especially if you had Paul Rudd in really short shorts. But we know now that the Earth can, in fact, be too hot for humans. In fact, it was back 40, 50, 60 million years ago. Too hot for humans, great for large reptiles like dinosaurs. But I'll direct your attention toward the right-hand side of the screen here, where we've added on more recent temperature observations and then climate model data. And what we see there is we have already broken out of that civilization temperature band. And if we continue on the same trajectory, we'll be breaking out of that temperature band of what humans have experienced in our existence. So what this helps us see, this climate science helps us see that climate change isn't just about warmer temperatures, it's about instability. And it's about the fact that we have never maintained civilization in a changing climate before. That is unprecedented. It is a paradigm shift, and we are going to need new skills, new tools, new sensibilities, values, old wisdom to help us live well and thrive within that new paradigm. And entertainment serves a really important role to help us visualize that. Because there are a lot of things that still internalize and assume that climate stability will continue. Lots of things that we have in this world that assume that the past will be, that the future will be like the past. City storm sewers are designed for certain amounts of precipitation that are very specific to the history of that place. Our power systems are meant to withstand certain maximum temperatures. Residences in many places are meant to keep heat in rather than keep it out. And we even have lots of cultural practices, like schools have summer vacations and seasonal sports. And all agriculture, whether it is irrigated or not, is dependent on steady precipitation somewhere in some way. So from here, we have two main jobs to do. One is keep that stable climate from deteriorating any further. That's mitigation. But then we also simultaneously need to make sure that all of the things on top of it are more secure, less vulnerable, more connected, and more prepared for the changes that are to come. And that is adaptation. Both of these things need to be happening right now simultaneously and need to be reflected in our storytelling. So that's kind of the big picture context for understanding what climate change means at this moment in time. But if we're going to world build with climate science, we need to start to get practical, right? So let's understand, well, what level of warming are we at? Where have we been? Where might we be headed? And these are all going to correspond with some of the maps that I'll show you that you can use in your world building exercise. So in the 1980s, we passed a half a degree of warming beyond pre-industrial temperatures. So that's a half a degree of warming beyond that green band that I showed you earlier. In the 2010s, we passed 1 degree of warming. And we're very close to 1.5 degrees of warming at this point. I'm sure a lot of you heard that last year some of the climate observatories said that we breached that threshold on a 1-year basis. That doesn't mean we are at 1.5 degrees now. It takes kind of a few years of sustained global average temperatures at that level, but we're very close to it. The pledges that governments and companies have made are not going to be enough to keep us below 1.5, and even with rapid decarbonization. So these are conditions that we just need to be prepared for. At 2 degrees, we're still kind of on track for 2 degrees of warming. If we rapidly decarbonize, it may happen a little bit later, maybe more like the 2050s or 2060s. And then at 2.5 degrees, now we're starting to get into what, at least with current kind of plans for rapid decarbonization, that we can avoid. And same thing with 3 degrees of warming. So the way to think about this, and the maps that we'll look at, is that some of these we just need to be prepared for, need to understand these conditions, and need to start putting things together to live in that world. And some of these are just helpful to know what it is we want to avoid. And so while that's really practical information, it can also feel pretty abstract, but climate science has given us these great tools, this climate model data, so that we can actually visualize what that change might look like or feel like in different localities around the world. So we're going to explore some of those places. We're going to start with Miami. It's a place that's close to my heart. But the other reason that I wanted to visit Miami is because it's a place that we talk about a lot with climate change, right? Comes up a lot. How many times have you heard the phrase, well, Miami's just going to be underwater? A lot, right? So let's use climate science and say, okay, is that actually the case? Is Miami actually going to be underwater? And some information kind of leads us to believe that. So this is a piece from the New York Times. I want you to just focus on the Miami box up there, showing 100% of it being underwater, right? This is looking at sea level rise. So these are this is climate model data looking at sea level rise. But the fine print up there says that basically this is looking at sea level rise if we do very little to decarbonize. And when these conditions would happen are centuries from now. Okay, so you just can see it move from 25 feet to 12 feet to 5 feet, but all of those scenarios are based on centuries from now. Now, what we need to worry about more in the near future is sunny day flooding, of course, but also storm surge in Miami. So this is another map that shows where the storm surge might go in 2020, 2050, or 2080 if we don't make any changes in terms of the infrastructure in Miami. But what we don't talk about a lot when it comes to Miami is heat and humidity in particular. And this is a place where a lot of people live, a lot of people like to visit, a lot of people like to party. And so what we're looking at here, this is a map from probablefutures.org, and you can use these maps in the world building exercise. So we're looking at a map of the number of days above 82 degrees wet bulb, which is 82 degrees and 100% humidity. And really all you need to know about that is that combination of heat and humidity has been deemed dangerous by the National Weather Service. And you can see that it probably is, it's certainly rare. So what we're looking at is in a past climate, I've selected the cell where Miami is here. And what this tells us is that this combination of heat and humidity in the past didn't really happen. It was rare. It maybe would have happened one day in a particularly warm year, but in an average year, Miami wouldn't expect this kind of temperatures. Fast forward, let's look at 2 degrees here and see what the potential conditions might be under that 2 degree scenario. Well, now it's something that we can expect a few days a year, but in a warmer year, maybe something like 26. And so this actually connects back to this idea that climate change is about instability, because the one that I showed you before, the scenario that I just showed you before, was the range of potential outcomes was 0 to 1, right? This range of potential outcomes is 0 to 26. So not only do we need to be prepared for higher temperatures in Miami, but we need to be prepared for a larger range of outcomes. These are conditions that will be difficult, but that we can actually prepare for, especially if we use this information. And so part of the exercise here will be thinking about how do we continue to thrive in these places? What kind of cultural norms do we need? What other kinds of systems do we need to put in place to make sure that we can thrive in these places and that Miami can continue to be a place where people love and visit? Okay, I put up nighttime temperatures here too. I mentioned people like to party in Miami. What's the clubbing scene gonna look like? Maybe that's not the most important thing, but this particular climate hazard, so nights above 77 degrees, scientists call that a tropical night. As you can see here, in the past climate, Miami would experience something like 2 months of it, or in a warm year, something like 136. And then that doubles at 2 degrees of warming. We know that in hot nights, crime goes up, violence goes up. We know kids' cognition goes down the day after hot days. How do we prepare for that? Okay, let's move to a place that's more near and dear to your hearts, I would imagine, LA and the film industry here, and also look at heat. So this map is the number of days above 113 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not I've never experienced this particular temperature. I don't know what it's like, but that's why you all are here. That's why we made this information available to everyone, because you will know best what this might mean for the filming industry and how you need to prepare and how you need to think about it. So you can see, of course, the numbers increase over the warming scenarios. All right, let's move to the next location. Oh, no, we're still in Los Angeles, but we also need to think about water in Los Angeles. Of course, water scarcity has always been a topic of conversation here, but a really important thing to know about climate change is that warmer air holds more moisture. So the warmer atmosphere can hold moisture up there for longer, creating elongated dry periods below, but then it can come down in large quantities too. So this climate hazard here that I'm showing is the amount of precipitation in the 1 in 100-year storm in LA, and that will increase by 1/2 inch and then by 1.5 inches at 2 and 3 degrees of warming. Is the infrastructure in LA prepared for this? How could we harness when big storms do come through to be able to use that water in times that we need it? This, of course, is the LA River, and when we think about how the climate will change in different places, we also need to recognize what climates we rely on, because it's not just the climate here in LA, but in LA, we rely on the climate of the Sierra Nevadas. That's where the water comes from. And so this is a map of snowy days. So you can see in this particular place in the Sierra Nevadas, in kind of the average year, in the past climate, there were 44 days where there might be snow. At 1 degree of warming, that goes down by 9 days, 2 degrees, and 3. And it's actually going to be stored. It won't be stored for as long, because these freezing temperatures in the Sierra Nevadas used to very conveniently store water so that it melted gradually over time. The last place we'll visit is also a place that I know well, Boston, Massachusetts. It's a place where a lot of people, a lot of kids, students show up every fall to go to one of the many colleges that are there. It's also a very old city, and it was designed around a very mild climate, a very specific climate. So even if the climate conditions aren't as extreme in, say, LA or Miami or in other places, it's still going to be different. And we still have designed everything in Boston for the climate of the past. So this is looking at the number of days over 90 degrees. We've got the average year and the warmer year there, and you can see how that increases. So how do we think about what that means for the college experience in Boston, or what we need to do with with infrastructure in Boston, how we take care of each other during heat waves? And then again, we need to think about not just that particular place, but the region. So this is a map of change in wildfire days, and I'll go through it quickly, but you can see that almost everywhere on the East Coast, the number of wildfire days, danger days, increases significantly. And so this, of course, as we know, can have impacts on air quality all throughout the region and in many different places. Now, one thing that I want to bring up here is that while the East Coast is not used to dealing with wildfire, there certainly are places that are, including the West Coast. So how do we share knowledge and infrastructure as climates are changing and kind of turning into climates that are more like somewhere else used to be? And then finally, we can't forget about the global trends. We live in a very globalized society, and changes around the world are going to matter in all kinds of ways in specific locations. So this is, again, number of days above 82 degrees wet bulb. And I'll just work through the warming scenarios here. And you can see how these trends change and increase with these very high heat and humidity temperatures spreading across the tropics and in many other places. This is going to make a difference. This is going to drive people to different places. And we can either pretend that that's not going to happen, or we can prepare for it in a very intentional and humanitarian way. This is a map of extreme drought. Of course, this is going to matter very much to our food systems. Different places are lighting up here than the wet bulb temperatures. We need to prepare our food systems. How is this going to play out? So I want to introduce this concept of bounded imagination as we think about world building. There's world building that is not necessarily bounded by science or bounded by physics, but we are at a point in time where we need to tell stories that are bounded by what we know about how the climate works and how it might change in the future. We need to tell more stories on this planet with the constraints of this planet, because this actually is the best planet in the galaxy. It's the best planet that we know of. It's pretty awesome, I think. It's also amazing that we understand it. This is not like AI. You can understand the fundamentals of climate science. We have a lot of information, and we can use that information to live within the boundaries of this planet. So we can still live well in a changing climate if we think ahead, imagine, and prepare. And I'm excited to see what you all do with this. So from here, I would like to invite my fellow panelists up, and we're going to have a conversation about world building before we move into the culminating exercise. I just realized I left my notes backstage, so I'm going to get it. Thank you so much. Hi. Thank you. I'm so thrilled to have you all on stage. You're all experienced world builders. You're all working with climate change and climate information in some way, and I know that a lot of people here in the audience are eager to follow in your footsteps, so thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. So I want to start by just asking each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us what you do frame it up for the audience, and then tell us what your entry point into world building was. Where did you start? Why did you start? What was your first project? And Adrienne, can we start with you?
Yes.
Great.
My name is Adrienne again. I'm a writer, singer, songwriter, ritual builder, future doula, gardener of ideas. And I mostly do that through writing books and through writing music and through creating these ritual experiences for people to process a lot of grief and then get oriented towards what we can do, because I think that those have to happen in relationship. And world building for me, I think Octavia Butler was my entry into it. The idea that she, as a Black woman, was like, I'm writing Black people into the future. I'm writing young Black genius girls who actually have the whole solution in their heads and just need people to listen to them and just need to learn to step into their power and their voice. That really appealed to me as a young Black little smart Star Trek watcher. I also think Star Trek had a lot to do with it. My dad, I had an interracial family, and my dad grew up in the Deep South, and he watched Star Trek, and we watched Star Trek as a family, and it was like, there is a world in which we've already figured all this stuff out, and we figured out how to be in some relationship with each other, and we figured out how not to be colonizers, and we figured out how to be in relationship to worlds, and that each world has brilliance to it. So I'm sure that also had a lot to do with it. But yeah, I started reading Octavia over and over and saying, what would I build? How would I make the world differently than it is right now? And here we are.
Love that. Those trailblazers are so important.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Korn. I'm an author and an editor. I worked in women's media for about 10 years and then decided to become a science fiction writer, as you do. I think Octavia Butler was probably also my entry point. I fell in love with her work at a really young age and then, watched as my contemporaries started writing science fiction about themes that really connected with me, but I felt like what I didn't see in science fiction was any queer people. So I decided to start writing dystopian climate change fiction about queer people to answer the question, what will happen to us when this happens?
Wop, 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 wop. Okay, I just want to make sure it was on. Greetings, people of Earth. My name is Billy Allman. I am an astrobiofuturist.
Wait, go off.
What that essentially means is I get to work and explore in this very interesting intersection of space exploration, which I will not talk about after that last slide. Space exploration, biomimicry, this idea of turning to nature for inspiration and solutions, and futurism through this lens of creating restorative futures that are rehumanizing people, places, and systems. And that was inspired by the work of a brilliant architect named Deanna Van Buren, who said that any work that rehumanizes someone is restorative work. And so that's why the work that I do is referred to as restorative futures. And it was, in a lot of ways, in terms of world building, inspired by being a nerd from the 90s. And Worf and Captain Benjamin Sisko were the first people that I saw who had a sense of purpose and honor and were intelligent. And I wanted to live in that world. And so that became a lot of what inspired me to do the work that I find myself doing now.
I want to be where the Klingons are.
Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh Klein. I'm an artist. I work in sculpture, video, film, also installation. I just opened like a large-scale exhibition at MoCA on Grand Street downtown. The show that I just opened is called Climate Change. It's part of a larger cycle that's looking at kind of key issues that are probably going to define the 21st century. It's definitely a dystopian project, like an immersive total installation that looks at various possibilities in the future through sculpture and moving image work and paint. So I think that's a good place for me. Sci-fi is a big part of this. Like the installation itself is science fiction, or I consider it science fiction. It's set in the future. Sci-fi has had a big role for me as well. Like Octavia Butler has been a big influence. Also Kim Stanley Robinson, Ursula K. Le Guin, kind of like sci-fi writers who are thinking about radical politics. I have to admit, I've also watched Star Trek my whole life.
We have to admit it.
But I didn't really take it seriously until the last few years when I realized, oh, what happens off of the military spaceships? You know, like what does the rest of the society look like? And then you realize it's actually like there are a bunch of space communists. So it's, you know, it's fascinating to kind of think about like what a post-scarcity, abundance-based society might look like if you took it out of Star Trek and started thinking, well, what might it look like sooner in our society? Although I haven't gotten there yet, but eventually.
Lynn.
Get there. Hi, everybody. I'm Lynn Renee Maxey. I'm a screenwriter and storyteller. I focus completely in sci-fi and speculative fiction. I'm also co-governor of the Writers' Peer Group for the Television Academy. And in my copious spare time, I'm also chair of the board for a nonprofit here in LA that provides practical, individualized support for new arrival refugees and their families and communities. It's called Miri's List. Okay, and I feel like I am with my people here, but my first intro into world building and understanding the possibilities of that was also probably Star Trek. Sitting with my dad watching this future world that seemed kind and hopeful and open to people and places and languages and customs that weren't necessarily our own. Which wasn't always something that I saw reflected in my world, so I got really interested in that. And then probably one step, many steps beyond that, let's be honest, was Margaret Atwood. Because I found her work in college, absolutely fell in love with it, almost passed out when I wrote on The Handmaid's Tale and got to go further into creating the world and imagining a world where, you know, dark, terrible things have happened, but there's still hope and there's still connection, and that kind of becomes my guiding light as I'm going through and building the world. It's like, even though there's difficulty, even though awful things have happened, it's not all bad, and today is not forever. It keeps me from losing my mind when I'm writing stuff, honestly.
Awesome. Thank you. I love the commonalities between all of you, but you're all practicing world building and applying world building in totally different contexts, using totally different media and methodologies. And so I'm curious, is there an accepted definition of either world building or futurism, or how would you define it? We don't have to necessarily go in order, but Adriana,
Let's start.
to start with you.
I mean, I think that there's this idea for many of us that we're born into a world and it's like everything already exists and it is the way it is, and whoever's teaching you the culture wants you to believe that. Mm-hmm. And so I think world building is the moment when you realize this is all made up. Mm-hmm. Every single part of this is made up. Someone made up the whole way the earth functions was beyond me, but then what humans have made into it, it's all made up. And so then you start to take on a responsibility of, well, I could do it. Like someone wrote commandments and someone else wrote instructions and someone else wrote a mandate and someone wrote, all of that has been written. And at a certain point you say, well, what if we were writing it? If we were writing it collectively, if we were writing stories that included us, that's world building. I think the futurist piece is interesting because I used to really orient to being a futurist, and I've really been reclaiming being a nowist. I'm like, oh, the future is only what I'm willing to practice right now and what we're willing to practice right now. And I think to be a futurist means you have to be super present and super realistic with what's actually happening right now and living and practicing as much of it as you can in this moment. To me, that's what a good, high-quality futurist is actually looking like.
Great answers.
Yeah, God, I don't know what I can add to that. I mean, for me, I think like when you think about fiction, the people in your books are shaped by the world and the world is shaped by the people. And so when you set a book in the future, you have to think about the natural consequences of the things that are happening now. And I think as the world builder, I do think it's your job to not make things worse than they could possibly be, because I think things could get pretty bad realistically, and like we don't have to fictionalize the apocalypse. But I think like when you think about the world and what might become of it, I think we have, or there tends to be a fantasy about the fact that like if there's a threat to humanity, that we will unite against it. So whether it's climate change or like aliens or a comet, that a united humanity will create a new world. But I think like the reality is that people will act like they're acting now, which is that class loyalty kind of trumps human loyalty. So when I think about world building, I think about the extensions of that and where that could lead us.
Amazing.
Damn, that was good.
People are sweating more as it goes down
It's
the
not
line.
the lights, it's all these great comments. No, I think that it's hard to add anything to that. I think world building at its essence, I think, is really the idea of normalizing aspirations or constructs or phenomena, and then using that normalization as a way to explore different perspectives or new possibilities of what can come out of the normalization of these things, right? And I think that the futurism side, it really is, any futurist worth their weight in salt or gold is really digging into the past. And there's this West African idea of Sankofa, of reaching back into the past to gather the things that we will need for the future. And I think that any type of futurism is really rooted in this idea of what have we learned or what have we not learned, and how can we project a solution for that into the future.
I think maybe I disagree about not taking things too far into dystopia. I think dystopia and utopia are both really interesting areas to explore. Like for me, world building is really about they're like projections, they're experiments within fiction, like running different scenarios that are fictional to explore like what might life be like under these conditions for certain people of certain classes. And I think for me, dystopia is an interesting zone to explore, especially coming out of the pandemic, which was a dystopia that we all just lived through and that's continuing for many people. And that really exposed a lot of like class problems in the United States in ways that I don't think many of us had seen before. One of the questions that I keep thinking about in the work that I'm doing is like, well, what does the future look like for working people? What does the future look like for essential workers? Like I've come to see the pandemic as a kind of dry run for the climate crisis, coming back to what Allison was talking about in terms of instability, but which I think about in terms of disruption. Like we just had this 2-year masterclass in disruption of daily life, but then we're going to have like much, much more disruption as the century keeps going. And I think world building and science fiction is a way to kind of explore what that could be like, and then to ask the questions, do we want to live through that? And like, if not, like what do we want? And I think that's where the utopian side of it comes in, which is something that has been largely discarded, especially by people on the left over the last 50, 60 years, is to ask the question, what kind of society do we want to live in the future? And I think, we do need to kind of go into that at some point. Like it can't just be Star Trek. There have to be other visions that don't just involve like, fighting aliens with like prosthetic makeup on their foreheads.
It's the makeup.
Yeah. It's always the makeup. I think the only thing I would add to this is, for me, world building, this is coming from me being a screenwriter specifically in television, where, the thing that you say in episode 3 of season 1, like somebody will remember that in season 4, episode 3, where they come back and they're like, quick question, you were saying that this, and you're like, that was 3 years ago. And they're like, great, I watched it yesterday. So anyway, like I was saying, So I'm constantly thinking about the kind of internal world that you're building, that it's consistent. Because as soon as it's inconsistent, as soon as you say one thing in one season and a completely other thing the next season, it takes people out of it, which means you're also going to lose your audience. You're going to, they're going to get distracted about that instead of paying attention to the story that you're wanting to share. And then it also runs the risk of saying, like, let's use the example of like, hey, in this world, we're going to do nothing about climate change. So here's the possibilities. And then a season down the road, you're saying, well, nothing's actually different. And the thing that your audience takes away from it, instead of like, hey, the climate crisis is real. This is something we actually need to think about, work towards, plan for. What they learn is, oh, I don't have to do anything. Because I saw in season 4, it's totally fine. The world is fine, everything's fine. And it's that kind of inconsistency that, especially if you're, standing up and saying like, hey, hi, I'm Lynn, I write science-based science fiction. I spend my days talking to NASA scientists. Like, I have to then respect the stuff that they give me, the information, even if, I actually want to crawl under my seat for a lot of it and just plug my ears and not listen to it because it's terrifying to me. You can still tell those stories in a way that brings hope and creates a world that people are interested in and that tells the truth.
Can I add one thing, Allison, too? When you were talking about trying to plan things with multiple possibilities, right? There's China Miéville is another incredible sci-fi writer who I really love, and he has this concept, I think in the book The Scar, of a possibility sword. And I think about it all the time. It's like, how do we move through every scenario with all the possibilities and be, it's like, oh, all of these things are actually still possible. And right now, I think we live in the realm where it's only what is politically possible. That's all we think about. And what's politically possible is actually really small and mostly false solutions, right? So then we get stuck in this loop where we're arguing over how much of the compromised false solution are we going to get. And we forget that actually the possibility needs to still be so much wider. So that also feels like the gift I think I see amongst futurists, right? Is that they're like, oh, there's still a lot of paths that are available here. And even I can make a wild turn in season 4 if I've shown the possibility of it, right? At some point earlier. The only stories I can't follow is I'm like, that's not possible in your world, and so now you look dumb, Yeah. But I think a lot of us look a little dumb. We're living in an absurdist world right now where people are so disconnected from any kind of science, so disconnected from any kind of fact. And so it's like, I keep thinking like, oh, how do I go make something seem possible even to those who are super in the absurd world? And maybe it's not science that's going to get them, but how do I make the science into a cool story that makes sense in some absurd world where there's no facts, right? And I'm like, can I stretch my brain to go there and come back? And that feels also like futurist work for me.
It's a great segue, and we only have a short amount of time left, unfortunately, so I think this will be the last question. But to that end, and kind of thinking about the information, the climate information, the data that's available, are you using climate data, climate science in your world building currently? If not, why not? I mean, Josh, I know that that there's a conscious choice on your part not to in the exhibition. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and maybe each of you could just tell us a little bit before we have to close.
That's not totally true. I think what I said was I'm not a research-driven artist, which is a type of artist that exists. I don't say, oh, I'm making this work about this research, let me spend years doing that. But I do a lot of research in my work. Like the videos that are up at MoCA right now, I did substantial research into firsthand accounts of survivors of the hurricanes over the last 20 years and the wildfires in California, and then integrated that into the scripts that I was writing with my friend Tamaya. And then I've also been reading about this for the last 20 years, but I know that there are things that I read in, US military reports, UN reports, but I'm not necessarily binding myself to them. I know binding like bound kind of parameters important for you. But for me, like I still want flexibility, like as somebody who's making art and fiction. And, you know, I feel like sometimes for narrative, you kind of need to go outside of boundaries and take things to extremes in order to like prove a point or show people where they're going.
Yeah, I love the idea that it's a choice. You know, you can choose to kind of have those constraints or choose to step outside of them a little
Because
bit.
one of the things that I think is important, you know, and is important for artists and writers and filmmakers, what we can do is tell stories. You know, like scientists are giving us data, which is very important. But I think a lot of people don't know what to do with that data. You know, like all these slides with statistics, it's fascinating. But people need to find a way to understand, what does this look like in our own lives? What are the experiences that we've already had that can connect us to this thing that's looming in the future? And I think, you know, our politicians do a horrible job at making any of this feel relevant to any of us, which is why our political system is failing. But I think, you know, like artists and thinkers and writers and sci-fi authors, they have that potential. And like, you know, I think we need to set more stories that in a world that's dealing with climate change, like as Allison's saying, because we need to help people visualize that.
Yeah, that's why we're all here. Billy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree in a lot of ways. I think that there's the data, there's how you use the data to, we were talking about this earlier, empower people to own these issues. And part of that is you want to maintain the integrity of what the data is saying, but also allow people to interpret it in a way that will allow them to act at their scale and their capacity, right? So with a lot of the work that I do, it's kind of inverted, where we're looking at how these organisms who have been existing for millions and billions of years have solved a lot of these problems related to climate that we are challenged, that we're currently looking for solutions for. They've already figured it out. So the data is in the background to finding the solution, but it's still present and it still maintains its truth. And I think that that's a huge part of it, is being able to find ways to make the data relevant while also keeping the integrity of what it's saying.
Yeah, Lynn, you were saying earlier that about that information that operates in the background, even if you never actually talk about it.
Yeah, it's part of that keeping the world consistent. But I love what Billy was saying, because there's something really cool about the world when we all live out of our superpowers. Like, we don't all individually have to save the entire planet all at once. It's like, okay, are you a writer? Okay, write about this. Are you a lawyer? Okay, look into the law. Are you, like, whoever you are, whatever you're good at, there's a piece that's specific to you that then we all bring together. And, you know, 1% of change isn't a ton, but a lot of 1% really can add up over time. And yes, I'm an incredible optimist, and I'm aware of this, especially on a panel like this. But I think that it's important, and I think it's helpful to know. So yeah, I like finding all the experts and just being like, tell me your story. Can I read your paper? What's the question that I don't know to ask, that I absolutely should ask? And usually, like, you know, then everybody like throws whatever they were talking about overboard, and just like, you know, suddenly my Zoom call is 2 hours long doing the research because somebody's so excited that I've finally asked them the question about the thing they want to talk about. But there's good stories in there, great world building opportunities, and good possibilities for our future.
Gabrielle, any last thoughts?
Yeah, my process is pretty similar. I do use data a lot for my world building. I think it's really helpful to read reports and talk to experts and, you know, figure out what the place is going to be. But I think where the creative license comes in is in the storytelling on top of that. So it's not so much that the science limits the story, it's that the science, you know, allows the story to be born, and then the fiction is what people invent, how they relate to each other, and how they survive. And, you know, I don't know, I prefer to world build based on things that people are predicting, just because I do grounded sci-fi, which is, of course, different from other kinds of sci-fi.
I love hearing the different approaches for this. I think for me, I get really fixated on like one little thing. Like I'll learn one piece of a story. So after Hurricane Katrina, I went down and I was talking and building and working with communities, and the oak trees were among the only things still standing. And I asked how, and it was like they're all holding on to each other underground. And so the storm came and they were able to move and bend and adapt. So I then wrote this trilogy about a plague in Detroit and a climate catastrophe and all these things happening. And the thing that I was trying to figure out is what would it look like if the humans were oak trees in terms of how we got through. Not everyone's going to make it, but some of us are going to hold on to each other underground, and some of us will communicate in a mycelial network, and some of us will do this. And so when I see the catastrophe facts, right, that I'm like, okay, what on earth will know how to survive that? And then how can we learn from what on earth will know how to survive that? So even when it was too hot for humans, who was here? What did they know? How did they stay cool? What do we need to learn, right? So that's, for me, how I'm constantly trying to process the brilliance of the design of this world and the brilliance of even how it's changing. Because I also think in some ways it's changing to be like, y'all don't go here. You're not compatible with me, and trying to break up with us. And so I'm also trying to figure out how this data can tell me how to be a good partner to the earth, and how we can all be like, give me one more chance, baby. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much. And I think from here, we're going to do an activity. So Esteban and Allie, come on out.
Yeah, we're here.
Yay. Mine works.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our incredible panel. Yes, another round of applause. This piece of programming meant so much to all of us co-founders. We have all dabbled in world building ourselves, and I'm a TV writer, and this is like, these conversations are dream come true to me. So I really hope you all got a lot out of this, and now we're all gonna talk about it, which is super exciting. So Esteban and I, as some of our panelists, are gonna lead your breakout groups. So as everyone else exits, we will kind of transition into grouping all of you, which is going to be a fun task. Esteban, thoughts on this task?
Yes, a beautiful task. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna divide into 5 groups around equal numbers, okay? Don't leave. No, you're in it.
Wait, Esteban, no. Okay, yeah, no leaving. Guys, you just sat through all this information.
I'm gonna chase him
and you
down,
don't want
don't
to
worry.
talk about it? Oh, wow, I can see everyone now. Okay, great. So, clearly, we got to make this left side one group. So could all of you who are kind of back there kind of gather in the center, like where the person in the white shirt just kind of jumped? Yeah, where those people, wave your hands if you're in the middle. Yes, okay, everyone move towards those people.
And then this is clearly one group. Why we all feel it. Sort of solidarity over here. Over here to maybe this is Allie. And I feel like she sort of would represent this contingency. Don't you think, Allie? Yeah.
Yeah. So everyone behind Allie, you join into a group in the back.
Yeah. Forward Allie, back. And then is one group, and then everyone back here is another group.
Yeah, and then if this like little kind of clump right here could move behind the soundboard, we're gonna do a little group in the back right there too.
Yeah, I think this is. People are like, is that a full group? Everyone's talking. I go, yeah, this is the best.